So now we have our next panel here, and it's my pleasure to introduce Caleb Yant. Caleb is the Deputy Director of the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department. He's a graduate of Oregon State University. We'll forgive that for the moment. Where you earned a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration with a focus on accounting and an MBA from the University of Phoenix in Technology Management. We so appreciate your being with us here today and welcome you to begin the panel discussion.
Give me 1 second here. I feel like I need to adjust it for my height. Is that the right volume? Hi, everyone. Again, my name is Caleb Yant. I'm the Deputy Director at Oregon Housing and Community Services. I use he, his, him pronouns. And I really just appreciate the opportunity to be here, to be in this room. For our agency, for the recovery effort, this is really a really good inflection point in our recovery as we really begin to transition from our state-funded response and recovery to efforts to ReOregon. ReOregon is the suite of programs that we are looking to administer through the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Programs, which we're here to talk about through this panel today. We have made significant progress in many areas, and there are really good things coming. This is largely thanks to the state legislature's support for crucial immediate funding that has kept survivors housed and built a foundation for the CDBG DR programs that are about to come online. Really a huge amount of thanks to our local partners, community action agencies, long-term recovery groups, culturally specific organizations that have done the really grueling work of counseling survivors, of understanding their needs and connecting them to resources and housing. Not everything has gone perfect, as you know. This work is new, it's new to Oregon, and we've learned a lot. We've already begun implementing and will continue to implement those lessons learned as we move forward. Suffice to say, there's been a lot of work done, some that has resulted in very tangible results for survivors, and some behind the scenes that are just as crucial to keeping things moving and getting to our next phase of recovery and getting that going on the right track. However, there's still so much more to do. If I could point to the right direction. Oh. There we go. Just some housekeeping here. After I'm done, we'll hand things off to talk briefly about CDBG DR in general, and then more specifically what we're planning to do with Oregon's allocation and next steps in our recovery. ICF is our program implementation partner. They'll be covering the lion's share of the presentation portion of this session. And then our team from Oregon Housing Community Services Disaster Recovery will be here to make sure we have a good chunk of time for Q&A. ICF has supported disaster recovery efforts for more than 100 state and local governments over the past 25 years, including leading efforts in New Jersey in Hurricane Sandy and Texas after Hurricane Harvey. They've been working closely with us since mid-September to help to get all of these programs positioned for launch. So maybe right now, I have a few more comments before I hand it over, but we can invite the ICF crew and OHCS to come up and give brief introductions, and then I'll tee up the rest of our time. You want to go first? Yeah.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ryan Flynn. I'm DRR Director for OHCS.
Nate Trombley, Program Manager with the ICF team.
Matt Betz, Operations Director from ICF.
Marinangeles, also known as Marina, Gutierrez Rivera, ICF, and I'm the Deputy Policy.
This feels like graduation all over again. Chelsea Catto, Chief Policy Officer for OHCS DRR Disaster Recovery.
Thanks, Ralph. So as you can see, so there was a timeline that you all have in your table in front of you, and you can see in that timeline handout, we've done a lot together since the days immediately following the Labor Day 2020 fires. I had the privilege of working with many of you throughout this room through the Housing Recovery Support Function and ultimately the Disaster Housing Recovery Task Force when we worked together to stand up sheltering and intermediate housing through state and FEMA funding. The 2020 wildfires compounded what was already an existing affordable housing issue during the height of COVID-19. Local governments, community action agencies, and long-term recovery groups came together to solve local challenges with sheltering and emergency support coming from the state and from the federal government. When FEMA assistance wasn't enough to fill gaps for all survivors, local governments and nonprofits swooped in to help, while OHCS used its funding resources from existing programs like the Manufactured Housing Replacement Program, the LIFT Affordable Rental Housing and Homeownership Development Programs, and other affordable housing programs to replace damaged housing and build new affordable housing. In those days, there was no guarantee that there was even going to be CDBG DR funds. While it was the biggest housing disaster that Oregon has ever experienced, it wasn't significant enough on its own to mobilize Congress into passing a separate appropriation. It had to wait for the larger disaster appropriation cycle, which delayed the first step in the CDBG DR process. I need to get better at that. I still trip over that acronym. It delayed it for over a year. In that interim period, local and state efforts were given a big boost by the Oregon legislature when they appropriated $150 million in state funding for housing recovery needs. It was through that our partnerships grew as community action agencies and other local partners had stepped up to implement WIRA, which was OHCS's, our agency's state-funded flexible housing recovery program. The WIRA implementers have grown your own relationships with long-term recovery groups, with housing authorities, with other culturally specific organizations and nonprofit organizations, all of which has led to the incredible network of disaster case managers, housing navigators, and local leaders who are committed to getting funding to struggling survivors. With these state funds, we've been working with you to try and strike the right balance between accountability with trying to get funding out as quickly as possible, all while knowing that the federal CDBG DR funds are coming with much stricter rules. Just to highlight a few milestones that are on this slide up here, we've managed to achieve a great deal to date through these partnerships. The WIRA program that I mentioned earlier supported more than 1,100 survivors, providing rental assistance, immediate sheltering, temporary housing, and ultimately permanent housing. Across the funding sources, close to 900 households have received support to get back into permanent housing to date before considering the CDBG DR funds that we're here to talk to today. And another 400 will receive permanent housing with the remaining state funding that's going to be coming online. This was also the first recovery of the size where nobody needed to be kicked out of FEMA temporary shelters. We ultimately placed more than 200 survivors into temporary or permanent housing. And this all helped to lay the important groundwork for the CDBG DR funding with park development that would be ready in time to provide options for survivors. We're committed to continuing our partnership with you as we move into implementing the CDBG DR funded programs through coordination and through various direct funding opportunities. For example, we're continuing to fund disaster case managers and outreach and intake staff who many of you have hired to work with survivors and have been supporting them for years. It doesn't make sense to starting into that from scratch. After WIRA rental assistance funds were exhausted, we were able to dedicate other funds to affordable rental housing support, and we'll continue that assistance through the Intermediate Housing Assistance Program through CDBG DR. We released the peer guidelines to local governments, to long-term recovery groups, to nonprofits and special districts long before HUD signed our grant agreement. So you could start thinking about how to use those flexible funds in your communities. We're expecting some of the peer selection committees to identify their projects in the coming months. To close my kind of introduction talking points here, again, this is in thanks to a lot of the people that are in the room who have been working on this in the last couple of years. I want to be really clear. This is not by any means a victory lap. We have just begun the race, but we're also not at the starting line. A huge thank you to our community partners for the work that you've done and how vigilant you've been with telling us what you and your communities needs. Thanks to the dedication from our state legislators providing critical resources to keep recovery moving. And a humble thank you to the disaster recovery team at OHCS, which has begun working hard to translate the complex federal rules into programs that are actually going to meet the needs of the communities. With that, I'll hand it over to our ICF team to talk about the next phase in the CDBG DR recovery.
Thanks, Caleb. We appreciate being here today and having the opportunity to work with OHCS and these local partners in this historic wildfire recovery effort. My name is Matt Betz. I'm a director with ICF, and I'm here, as Caleb mentioned, supporting the OHCS ReOregon initiative. I have with me my two colleagues, Marina Gutierrez and Nate Trombley, who I'll be handing off to in turn. So. My Tai Chi. All right, so we're going to go through a couple slides that really kind of talk about what this CDBG DR funding is, how it came to be, and how it works. So when you're looking at this slide up here, the one big takeaway I want everybody to keep in mind is that the Federal Department of Housing Urban Development, HUD, has a branch of funding called the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery, or CDBG DR. And this funding is designed specifically to provide post-response funding for recovery and mitigation efforts. So that means that CDBG DR is intended to be the caboose on the response and recovery train. So at their core, these HUD funds are intended to focus on long-term recovery and prioritize recovery based on household income. These funds are sourced from federal tax dollars, and as such come with requirements to supplement but not supplant or replace other or ongoing recovery efforts. These funds are designed ultimately to be available longer term than FEMA funds. And HUD also requires that recipients, mostly state and local governments, to design programs that ensure benefits are not being duplicated and that the same work is not being paid for twice due to the source of that funding. So looking at this slide here, this is the process that every grantee across the country, regardless of disaster event, has to follow in order to get funds into implementation. This process is very linear, and it requires a considerable amount of coordination between state and federal agencies. Now, one key difference between this funding and another major federal funding source, FEMA, is that FEMA has a rolling pot of funding, whereas each DR allocation has to be individually appropriated. So starting in the upper left, our step one, following disaster event, the president declares a disaster and Congress appropriates funding for the entire year. HUD then does a needs analysis to allocate funding. And once that is allocated, grantees do a similar but independent needs activity. Once grantees have an approved action plan, including completion of all public comment periods, and a federal grant agreement with HUD has been executed, grantees can then engage subgrantees to sign subrecipient agreements or begin implementation if those subrecipient agreements are not needed. Now, I'm sure that might sound familiar since many of you in this room are probably going through that process right now, or have talked with the state about it. So there are also handouts that should be on everyone's table as well that have Oregon-specific dates tied to this process up on the screen. There are also extras at the front if you haven't had a chance to grab one. So finally, implementation of all of this, implementation of the federal funding does mean that it also commences the federal oversight and monitoring period, which brings us to our funding pyramid. So I mentioned that HUD's CDBG-DR funding is designed as the funding of last resort. It's also structured to give grantees the flexibility to design programs that address community level needs while also building in mechanisms for programmatic consistency across all CDBG-DR funded project areas. Now, it's important to note here that this is not state funding. This is more complex than state funding and is more complex than FEMA funds as well. Again, FEMA funds, which are intended largely for response. At a fundamental level, the federal government has basic rules directing use of all federal tax dollars. On top of that, HUD has their own established rules and regulations to ensure funds are spent fairly and equitably and in ways that maximize the effectiveness of those funds, focusing on the highest and best use of those federal taxpayer dollars. Program design must account not only for these federal requirements, but also state policies and regulations, and as applicable, local regulations. So in whole, CDBG-DR must account for federal and state and local regulations during the development and deployment. So in administering this federal assistance, the state of Oregon and other grantees have agreed to both regular monitoring and ad hoc monitoring as part of its program design and administration. This oversight is taken at the federal level by HUD, the Office of Inspector General, or OIG, and the Government Accountability Office, or GAO. Now, to talk more about what these programs actually look like, I'm going to turn it over to Marina, our HUD subject matter expert.
Ooh. All right, let's see if I can do this. So Matt just kind of went through the basic overview of CDBG-DR, and we'll be bringing it back to Oregon. And it starts with the fall of 2021, when Congress appropriated $422 million to Oregon to address the remaining unmet need, recovery, and mitigation. And through the action plan process, OHCS designed 5 key areas to organize the funding. The most important and largest share of the recovery funds is dedicated to housing. Over 80% of the funds will be used for homeowner recovery, homeownership opportunities, and rental assistance. The remaining funds support the execution and operations of these programs through public services, infrastructure, and planning. As a federal requirement, 70% of these funds are dedicated to low to moderate income populations, or LMI. Next, I'll briefly run through the programs for a basic overview. We'll start off with the Planning, Infrastructure, and Economic Revitalization Program, better known as PEER. It's designed to respond to the unique recovery needs of each impacted county. This program was allocated $42 million to fund community-driven projects that support resilience and disaster mitigation. As many of you know, and as was referenced earlier by the director, this program kicked off earlier this year, even before OHCS signed their grant agreement with HUD. This was purposefully done to get ahead of the identification and construction of infrastructure needs that could benefit new housing construction or reconstruction. County selection committees are currently reviewing proposed projects from their partners and preparing to share those with OHCS for a compliance review. The Homeowner Assistance and Reconstruction Program, or HARP, was allocated the lion's share of the funds with roughly 50% of the budget. That's $205 million. The program will support homeowners with rehab, reconstruction, replacement costs, as well as any necessary site work, accessibility, fire hardening, and resiliency measures. The program will launch with a phased approach. The first phase, processing LMI households. Additional phases will be processed based on funding availability. In an effort to replace the destroyed housing stock and to support surviving renters, the Homeownership Opportunities Program, or HOP, is dedicated to support disaster-impacted first-time homebuyers. The program allocated $119 million, will invest in new affordable housing production and provide financial assistance for those to purchase a new home. The Intermediate Housing Assistance, or IHA program, is similar to the Emergency Rental Assistance that we've seen, or ERAP. The $20 million allocated to this program will provide continued rental assistance support to CDBG-DR eligible survivors until permanent solutions are secured. And lastly, we have the public services programs. There's a housing recovery services program and a legal services program, each with $6 million. These will help households seeking to participate in the housing programs with financial or legal hurdles to eligibility. In addition, these services will also help other folks who may not have qualified for other programs with housing counseling. Now that we've gone through those programs, I'm going to be transitioning over to Nate, who can tell us a little bit more about next steps.
So as Matt mentioned, it's been a long path to get the CDBG-DR dollars off the ground. And as Marina already mentioned, each of these programs includes an important tie-in for local community partners like yourselves. You all have been working with these survivors over the last years and know their circumstances better than we do. So the ReOregon team has been preparing programs for a level of federal oversight that has not been applicable to the other sources of funding that have been used to date. And this is going to be a transition to have such a focus on compliance compared to the other sources. The team is taking the time to set up these processes and steps in a way that makes it possible for both partners and for survivors to minimize the amount of complexity and to minimize the burden on those survivors going through the process. So this slide highlights, So this slide highlights many of the major tasks that are underway, but need to be handled carefully to ensure that projects are eligible, and also that processes place the least amount of burden on those survivors. So starting with PEER, projects are expected to start moving through initial stages in 2024, including environmental review, procurement, design, engineering. And as those projects make their way to OHCS out of those local selection committees, OHCS will perform a review to make sure each meet some basic CDBG-DR requirements before memorializing those in agreements to move forward. Knowing that compliance requirements involved with CDBG-DR, the team plans to provide detailed written guidance for the program, as well as training on those requirements and technical assistance as those projects move forward. On HART, the team is moving quickly on each of these tasks listed here that are needed to launch the program in early 2024, including launching a ReOregon call center that'll be available to answer survivor questions and also provide updates on application status, as well as partnerships with local organizations to support outreach and intake, and finalizing application development in a way that pushes as much of the work as possible from the applicant to ReOregon reps. Like PEER, we're starting with training for local partners to build a shared understanding of those federal requirements so that everybody is available to explain those requirements as questions arise. Rental assistance, housing counseling, and legal support for applicants are all expected to move forward on a similar timeline to the HART program to make sure survivors have wraparound support throughout the process, regardless of whether they're eligible for other programs, as well as a team of advocates to support them throughout the process. And finally, HOP's applicant-facing components will follow shortly behind in late 2024, once all the other programs are underway. So before I pass it over to the OHCS team for questions, I just want to make a quick call out of the ReOregon website that's here at the bottom of the slide. There you can find the action plan, more information about all the programs that we just went through, as well as some FAQs, an extensive list of FAQs that's going to be ever growing, sort of as the programs roll out. So with that, I will pass it over to the OHCS team, or whoever's emceeing the mic. Thank you all.
Just a little mini conference there to see where we're going with this. So I think we're going to do questions. From what's been presented, who has questions?
Hi, my name is Monica Johnny. I work for DSW Homes. We're a general contractor. So is this going to be a state-ran construction? You said pre-qualifying contractors, or is this homeowner selected? And then follow up to that question, are we going to have a tiered approach where we have tiers of GCs, or are you just going to have a pool of GCs and are assignment based or low bid? Have you thought through any of this yet?
Can you all hear me? This. I'm just gonna try that. Is that okay?
If you can hold it.
No, I'll hold it.
Yeah.
Hold it.
Thank you.
Great question. Thank you for that. So it's going to be at the moment, the way that the program is established, homeowners will actually execute contracts with general contractors directly for the HARP program. So we're going to do a blended program where we have a centralized pool of contractors that can be the selection choice for homeowners. So we'll have the ability to work with GCs, to evaluate them, to work with them on the policies, the requirements. And then we can also assist homeowners in understanding which contractors have availability, manage some pipeline of projects. But it's important to note that for a while, the last of disaster recovery work, year and a half or so, the state didn't have, or OHCS didn't have the authority to enter into agreements with contractors directly. The legislature passed that in the last session. I don't exactly remember what month anymore. I think in the summer. And so we're considering pivoting to a more centralized type of program that a lot of states do, where we would contract with general contractors directly, have a pool, and bid the work out to them. But I think that decision is now made. We'd get a lot of feedback from partners about that before we made that choice, and we'd probably do a blended type of approach either way, because we want to make sure that if homeowners prefer to enter into contracts with GCs directly, that we allow them that option, so that we can have as many different ways to do it. But the pool is really important so that we can make sure that we limit fraud, we limit issues with contractors, and make sure that survivors have a good experience in the program. Anything?
Other questions?
Thank you. I'm State Representative Charlie Conrad. The quick question I've got, because we're 3 years into it, the very last box that you had on the slide for the timeline was actually when you do the community centers and the outreach. What is your timeline for that? Because that's not going to happen in January, or am I wrong? And can we be hopeful that some of that community outreach to actual survivors is going to happen that fast?
Yeah, thank you. So we are working with partners right now to execute those agreements with CBOs and CAAs and LTRGs. The intention is to make sure that we're under contract with those agreements well before we open up application intake early next year, so that there's plenty of time to engage with survivors. And our intention is we would fund that effort for a years, make sure that the application window isn't short, it's long, that we have the ability to continue to make sure that nobody's left not recovered who should be part of the program. The other part of this is we are intentionally working with organizations that have been engaged with survivors to date. So we're going to continue to fund them. We're not attempting to replace that relationship in any way, but actually to broaden it, to add resources to it, and work with them directly to continue the work that they have been doing. So we've been in contact a lot. I think some folks might be in here who we've been talking to about those agreements. We shared one version, we're sharing another based on feedback that we got from organizations. And so we're anticipating signing those any week now, in preparation for starting outreach and engagement well ahead of application intake, having a pretty robust engagement strategy and communication strategy leading up to application intake. I hope that answers the question, but that's our intention.
Hey, Brian. Devin Thompson, Executive Director, McKinsey Valley Long-Term Recovery Group. You mentioned continuing to support disaster case management. One of my concerns is, especially people at the 80% AMI or 120% AMI, once they return home, they're still not going to be recovered. So how do you plan on continuing that support through the disaster case management program? Because you'll be supplying a home and appliances, but these individuals still won't have a bed to sleep in, those types of items. So long-term recovery is really long-term. It's not just getting them home, but it's getting them to the finish line.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for that question. And, I might see if there's others who have some thoughts on this. I think the first part of the answer is that's going to be an ongoing effort, working with partners like yourself to understand what the gaps are that remain, and making sure that we connect people with resources so that they can fully recover. I mean, that's the intention here. There's a role that I want to make sure that we hit on here as well, that Oregon Housing and Community Services in this recovery is really focused on the house. It's really focused on getting from, intermediate shelter or where somebody's at now, structuring the housing programs so that somebody can become a new homeowner or can move back home. And we have a partnership with DHS for more expansive services and provided $3 million already in continued case management wraparound services. That is something that they do better than we do. That's really what they have been doing in this disaster. And so I would not redirect the question to DHS by any means, but that we're partnered in that effort and want to make sure that we don't try to extend ourselves into a core competency that's not really, at least the disaster recovery and resilience division, but partner with organizations like DHS that are really established to do that. So that'll be a need that we continue to have our eye on and make sure that we're getting feedback. And if there are gaps, we can work on that together as state agencies.
So Karen over here, one of the things that we have run into in our community is I'm going to call it fun because I am not supposed to use 4-letter words in public, contractor fraud. Right. And so as the unmet needs table, as the LTRG, we convene the unmet needs table, right? And we have on this one specific contractor that we have spent an inordinate amount of time trying to support in doing the thing, have spent just initially $160,000 for 2 survivors that are still not home, right? That are at the gateway, that are shacked up with another family member, right? And we know that that's 2 cases that we've been made aware of. We also know this same contractor has 5 open cases through legal services. We know this is a canary in a coal mine. We know there's more of them. So what mechanisms, right? Because the LTRG, the Jackson County Community Long-Term Recovery Group, as a staff of 3, has put an ungodly amount of capacity into supporting these 2 households in navigating the CCB process and making sure that we're getting all of the I's dotted and the T's crossed. So they might be eligible for ReOregon. What are the mechanisms under all of these programs you have that are going to take this burden off of the local community to navigate contractor fraud, to make these survivors whole?
Yeah, thank you for the question and everything that, you're doing. I hear all of that in that question, all the work. And so what the overall program that you kind of heard about a minute ago, that's really starting to take shape and is going to start early next year. The HARP program in particular. OHCS is looking to bring resources, just like you said, to partner with organizations to supplement and create that oversight and compliance that is hard to handle on a multiple thousand potential applicant kind of program. So back to the first question about, how are GCs, general contractors, going to be able to enter the program? We're not going to sort of turn over that entire relationship to homeowners and GCs within the HARP program, but actually, open up an application to general contractors so that they can apply to enter the pool. In that application, of course, we're going to be looking at bonding, insurance. We're going to be getting a lot of documentation, background checks, whatever else is really required that we'll put together for the initial entry into the pool. And from that point on, be able to monitor the GC's work within the program. So if, of course, if they actually commit fraud, they wouldn't be in the pool anymore. We'd be able to remove them. And then as a state agency with connections to the contractors board, the DOJ, we could, expedite and work on those resolutions if there is fraud. The other element of this is, I don't know I know there's one general contractor in here. I don't know who else is, but, between today and GCs entering the pool, if they have been doing fraudulent activity, we have a policy already established and a process already established so that if we get those reports, we can consider that when they attempt to participate from the start in the program. So, we can probably reach out and discuss that case in particular with you. And I would say to any partner out there as we get going, if you know of those cases, there's a reporting mechanism that we can share to make sure that we're preventing that. But we've brought on construction management resources. That construction management resource with our implementation partner, ICF, is going to be a very robust level of oversight into the construction process, doing on the ground, on-site inspections of any activity, that those inspections passing quality control and policy checks would be required before any payments are issued through the program. So we'll have a great deal of that because we know that in CDBGDR, one of the most perennial issues with it is fraud from the construction side of things. So we're establishing a lot of safeguards so that we can do that, and then we can enable that case management connection with survivors to go well. And we can handle a lot of the paperwork and compliance on the other side.
I know, Karen, you also asked kind of how do we approach if someone has been a victim of fraud, ensuring that they can still participate in the ReOregon program. So we've, written into policy that because we want to make sure that someone who's experienced fraud, when you look at the duplication of benefits requirement of ensuring that people don't get funding for the same thing, that we have ways to address that so that they aren't kicked out of or unable to access those resources because they were victims of fraud.
Thank you. I forgot that part of the question, but just to be clear, duplication of benefits is a big issue, and those expended funds could be considered non-duplicative if the reporting is put together ahead of time. So we'd want to reach out to you to see that case and make sure that that's considered because we would not want somebody who's been the victim of fraud to be made ineligible in the program by any means.
Hi, Melissa Bauer here with Santiam Disaster Services. And I have a question for our specific counties, Marion and Lynn. Our disaster case managers have the ability right now to apply for funding through a unique opportunity through Marion County that has a contract, was granted funds through OHCS. And one of the obstacles that we're running into are households who are applying for funds that are mid-build. So they were building, they ran out of funds, they apply for funds. And because they built a home or started a home that was 100, 800, 1,000, I think, square feet over their pre-fire square footage home, they are being denied assistance. And we are being told that that is something that OHCS has given them that that guidance that it needs to be pre-fire to pre-fire. So my question is for CDBG-DR, will that be the same? Because we have a number of households in our area, and I'm sure across Oregon, that that's going to affect. And then my second question is, we have been told timelines, and now I appreciate seeing early of 2024. Is there a specific timeline, like a deadline that OHCS can give that by this date you will have the funds out to survivors? Or a contract, yeah.
Sure. So I think I didn't quite catch that, but I will try. So the first, let me start with the second question, and then we'll go back to the first question. So up on the slide here, we're saying early 2024, no later than the end of March 2024. As the weeks go forward, we're going to get more and more specific about what that is. Eventually, we'll have an hour of the day, let alone a day. That is the start of the application period. We by no means are hoping that it's the end of March, but we don't want to overpromise. We don't want to indicate something that we're not certain of right now. There's a lot of dependencies. This is a brand new program. It's a brand new, large effort within the state, first CDBG-DR award, I think, ever to Oregon. And there's a lot of infrastructure that we're building every day to get to that point. So there are dependencies on dependencies on dependencies to make sure that we can launch, and we don't want to skip any of that. We don't want to cut any of that time short in development of the program, so that when we start, it's a trauma-informed, good program for survivors, that when they start, there's resources there. We've worked through all the contracting pieces with partners. Everybody's trained, everybody understands the policy, and we can all support survivors really well together. We don't want to cut that short. So we'll get a lot more specific than this over the coming weeks. But right now, that's the time frame that we're targeting to not extend past. And in part, we really don't want to miss the construction window of summer through late mid fall. So we would not want to extend past that time. So for the first question, I think we could talk offline more, I think, about the county program. I don't know all the details of their program, and it is their program. And we signed an interagency agreement with them, or intergovernmental agreement, that allows them to establish some of those policies, right? And we've done that with their counties. It's an important part of what we're trying to make sure we are not the only funnel of production for survivors in the state for housing, that we work with partners, and that's something I want to make sure we talk about with the HOP program and our intention there. So they hold the policy. We've given some general, advice, or asked some general questions. And with HARP, if that will more or less be the way that things are structured. We can't sort of expand the footprint substantially. In some cases, we'll have to, for occupancy standards being met with HUD. So if somebody was in a home that was too small by HUD's definition of their household occupancy, we would have to expand it. But it's really a question about what the award would cover. If it'll be calculated based on the pre-disaster footprint plus household occupancy requirements, and that will, and other factors, and we'll come up with an award total. So it is the basis of CDBG-DR awards. That is a CDBG-DR specific answer, not necessarily a state funding specific answer. So again, I think we could connect offline and talk more about that.
Question here. Hi, I'm Tessa with the Jackson County Community Long-Term Recovery Group. In summer of 2022, OHCS came to our community in Talent and did what I think was the first ReOregon information session in person. And they did communicate to our survivors that there might be a potential for reimbursement if there was some funding left over. I was just wondering what your sense is on that, and if that might still be a possibility.
Yeah, Thank you. So reimbursement is an eligible activity with CDBGDR funds that would consider somebody's expenses to date as a potential repayment. So that's kind of the definition for anyone with reimbursement that's not clear. Right now, our action plan does not include reimbursement, and really it's not a complicated answer as to why. It's just there's a lot of survivors who are in intermediate housing or in shelter. We don't exactly know how many survivors are going to apply once we open up the application. And so, you know, from a recovery standpoint, we have to make sure that we're holding as much new funding as possible for people who are, you know, have not had any recovery yet. As we go forward, you know, if we reach a point where the application total and projection of all awards equals some portion that would allow us to redistribute funds, that would definitely be something that we would consider. We'd consider an action plan amendment, which would be a public process. So it is something that a lot of states do. We're in a position where application intake would be brand new. The total population of completely, you know, unrecovered survivors as of now isn't totally known, and we can't really project how much money we need out of HARP for that purpose right away. So it's definitely a possibility, but we need to make sure that we're considering the needs of, you know, of all survivors from the start.
Hi, I'm Denise Lupton, and I'm the homeownership supervisor for Access in Southern Oregon. And I just have really a point to make that I'm seeing with fire survivors who early on may have found some form of recovery, whatever that looks like for them, but they're housed. And now that we're 3 years into this, are finding that they are facing foreclosure. So they're going through new trauma. And so, sorry, Chelsea, I see that smile. So I want to just bring it up that we're tracking these. We currently have some state-funded programs in different departments of OHCS that are assisting as we do foreclosure counseling. But these are programs that will be coming to an end at some point. And I just want to sort of, you know, let's get through the ReOregon funding processes and get those settled first. But I would definitely like to know, if you happen to know at this point, what we might be able to be looking forward to for support for wildfire survivors in foreclosure cases.
Thank you, Denise. You're speaking my language. This is near and dear to my heart. I think, like you said, we have to, you know, get the funding going, but this is something that's really important to all of us because we are seeing this where I think it's a lot of manufactured homeowners who are unstably housed. They were permanently considered permanently recovered. I would say that if it's not, you know, if they're facing foreclosure or they're unstably housed, that's not a permanent recovery. So that's something we've been talking about, and we'll really rely on you guys to give us that information as well. And like Ryan said, you know, it's very common. This would require a substantial action plan amendment, but it is very common for states to have multiple substantial action plan amendments, because when you write the action plan, you know, you're at a point in time looking at information and data at that point in time. And, you know, things change, and we are ready and willing with the community's input to be able to make those changes. So it's definitely, I can't give you a specific answer, but that is definitely on our radar and something we're looking at. And then just screen's not up anymore, but you know, some of those other support services that we had up there, legal services, housing recovery services, we want to make sure that you know, we're kind of holding off on designing some of that because we want to launch the programs to really see what the need is and what those particular needs are for folks. And so I also, my personal thing that I want to do is maybe some financial counseling for folks, just kind of general financial counseling to help people think about, you know, we don't want to dictate what type of housing or how they choose to recover, but we want to be able to give them the support that they need so they can make those informed decisions.
Hi, I'm Tanya with Rogue Foodie Nights and also a fire survivor. And my question is, so with the last rounds of funds that we had in the Jackson County, we ran out of money. There was money one day and there wasn't money any left. So with this program that's coming, how do you guarantee that us fire survivors that still don't have a home will get a home?
Thank you for the question. And I think so that's really, I would kind of turn to the last two questions as part of my answer. We have really hard decisions to make about how to allocate funds. And so when we go back to looking at one of the last slides about the phasing, that's part of the HARP program. We're prioritizing people who have not recovered yet. I mean, all of that is clearly indicated there. So for people who've had no chance to recover, who are at or below 80% area median income, that's the priority group. And that's the group that we intend to, help recover before we advance to other phases and then to other opportunities like reimbursement or foreclosure prevention, which are both valuable, meaningful ways to distribute CDBGDR funds. But part of the hard decisions we have to make is we have to prioritize people who need it the most.
Hi, Anna, also a fire survivor, but I work with the Rogue Action Center. My question is, as far as like qualifications, when it comes to applying, we have seen a lot of families not qualify because they are above the AMI, but their needs are still there. There's like that gap of families that either own their own business, and because they own their own business, they don't qualify, or the number of family members or whatnot, or there's just a bunch of, I guess, roadblocks when it comes to communities that we've been working with. So when it comes to applying, and we've heard here a lot, those funds that are like very like, what was it? Low barrier, thank you, low barrier funds. What are your thoughts on that, and how would that be addressed when it comes to the HARP or the HOP for families that still need a home or don't qualify for like rental assistance, or aren't fully recovered? So that's my question.
Yeah, thank you. So again, I'm just referring to some of the slides and the information you heard before, that HUD has a requirement that we expend 70% of the overall grant, so 70% of $422 million, to benefit low to moderate income survivors, which they define as at or below 80% of the area county median income. That's how it starts. It's not always how it ends. So, and it's really based on data, data work that we would do with HUD. So again, after we open up applications and we get a really good look at who is applying, who still needs assistance, who has not recovered, at that point, and as we go through the program, we can adjust those numbers. We can go to HUD and seek changes to that methodology. Bear in mind, 30% of $422 million is, I'm not going to do that in my head, but it's still a lot of money, and it allows us to move into higher income phases. So, it's absolutely something that, the change between 80 and 81%, area median income is negligible, right? It doesn't matter in reality, and even up to 100% in many counties, and especially when you consider housing costs that people face for recovery, that these numbers don't always make the most sense when HUD applies that rule across the entire country, not, more or less blind to housing markets and how, people really face challenges in rehousing. So that's where we have to start, because we have to demonstrate to HUD that we are able to move into higher income phases. But again, to the last question, we absolutely have the priority that, lower income families who were impacted, who should benefit from this program and have not been able two should go first, and they should be the priority. But we will start there. We will work with that population first, and then we'll move into higher income phases and until the money runs out or until Congress gives us more.
Hey there, I'm Kendall Melvin. I'm the program director for Glide Revitalization. And my question is regarding timeline a little bit. So I know we're thinking early 2024 for funds dropping to subrecipients, but I'm also hearing of environmental reviews and general contractors having to apply to these processes. And that, in my head, I'm picturing wood hitting the ground in 2025. What do you guys think?
Great question. And I don't necessarily have an answer because we haven't done it yet, but for what I could anticipate, I think we absolutely could have a construction season that's pretty active this coming year. So in the summer of 2024 through till now, right? Next, in a year, so before the rainy season. A lot of the stuff with environmental reviews, we've been working on that process for a while. We did a tiered environmental review process where we split out the area-wide environmental reviews, and then we'll do site-specific ones for every property, which speeds up the environmental review process substantially. So we'll be able to do that. Those environmental reviews should take somewhere around 45 days. The process of general contractors applying and being screened into the program, we haven't done that once yet. I mean, we're going to be doing that quite a bit, but it's not a lengthy process. I think any given one of those could take an afternoon versus be really long. The time from application through to construction, we'll have very accurate, timelines as we get into it, but months versus a really long time. So, I mean, it's all relative. We'd rather do it in a day, but we have to meet all the HUD requirements. So I think we anticipate construction if everything goes to plan, this coming summer.
Hi, I'm Cass Cornwell from Fire Brand Resiliency Collective down in Southern Oregon. Speaking of timelines, I was just wondering, we've been told that these applications are most likely going to be denied the first time and we'll have to reapply. I'm wondering what kind of timeline that's going to be, like she was saying, wood hitting the ground in 2025. Are we likely to see this process fast enough to be building this building season, or will those denials hold that up?
Okay. We'd love to connect with you about the denial message. It's something we'd want to understand a little bit more and where that's coming from. I don't anticipate that the majority or most even of applications that are entered would be denied. Okay, well, we can connect with you to determine where that's coming from and try to make sure that we talk about whether or not that's accurate. Okay, I don't anticipate it would be. I think but if people are over income for phases, they would be put on hold. So if they're at 120% area median income, that's where we would be messaging broadly that that would be the next phase. But the phasing would be the main thing that would sort of determine which groups move first. But outright denials of applications, I don't anticipate a lot of that.
I just want like a really explicit statement from OHCS about when these funds are, like what's the end of the timeline, right? Because I know that there is a 6-year time clock on these dollars, at which point they need to be fully expended, right? And that time clock started in February, if I understand correctly. I don't think we've been explicit in this room about what that timeline is.
Okay, well, I'll do my best to answer that, but the reality is, within 6 years, that's the target timeframe. When we talk about an infrastructure project that we're going to fund with the county, those could take a really long time if it's roads or if it's some other kind of project. And so if we're looking at the broad grant, most states get extensions when they're doing infrastructure projects. For housing, that's where the lion's share of our effort, our infrastructure, our energy is going to be focused on making sure it's not 6 years, but it's, we are going really quickly into construction season next summer. And based on phasing and based on general contractor availability and the building, the factors that are not necessarily in our control, that it's not going to take all the way through 6 years, hopefully, to be doing housing.
Question here. So my name is Sylvia Serrano and I work for Office of Resilience and Emergency Management. I'm a social services emergency liaison. And I don't have a questions, but I just like to share what I do encounter and the work that I do day in and day out. We talk about the funds that have been made available to help with the recovery, and I think it's been great. I always like to celebrate those that have fully recovered, and I think we have to keep those fresh in our minds so that we can continue to stay positive. But I also encounter families out there that have applied for various programs, and because of their income and their situations, they're not eligible. And I can recall certain family structure, whether it's a family of two or a family, they're over income for some of these programs. And I guess what comes to my mind is that we are out there in the field engaging with these families day in and day out. And it's really difficult at times to be able to explain to them the policies, the processes, the barriers. And so I guess this is an ask that I have, is that as members of organizations, is that we advocate for people that are in those situations, that we do some sort of role playing to see what it's like to be a fire survivor and being told you're not eligible because you are just above the income limit, or now you're not eligible because you recovered too early and therefore you're going to lose your house. So I think that the more that we keep that fresh in the mind of those that are making these decisions, it would be more, it would put more of an effort to be able to get the funding that is really needed, specifically for the families that are going to be falling, in those gaps, that will not get the support that they need. And these are hardworking families, and their houses were destroyed just as those that were not, that were getting the assistance or have received the assistance to move forward.
Well, good questions and comments. I think it articulates the challenges that our communities have faced and some of the uncertainty and nervousness moving forward. I want to thank our partners at OHCS and ICF for being here and providing the information and answering some of the tough questions. Appreciate your time and your contributions and the work that we have ahead. Let's give our panel a round of applause.